Welcome to part 2 of Module 20 of Interpersonal Communication, the Dissolution of Romantic Relationships. First, a quick review. In the first video for this module, we talked about the first two stages in the disintegration process of Mark Knapp's relationship model for romantic relationships. Those first two stages were differentiation and circumscribing. In the differentiation stage, people's perceptions of differences begins to grow. In the second stage, which was circumscribing, people's patterns of communication begin to change. Now in this video, we talk about the third and fourth stages in the disintegration process. The third stage is what's known as stagnation. The term stagnation refers to this notion of things not moving forward. Things are at a standstill. So the stagnation phase can best be understood as this intrapersonal feeling that the relationship is not moving forward. You feel stuck. You feel as if the relationship is at a standstill. You feel like no matter what you do, the relationship doesn't get any better. Over time, this can lead to a feeling of apathy and a general lack of motivation to do anything to try and save the relationship. Attempts to repair the relationship just seem too overwhelming. Or there's a pessimistic attitude that one adopts that basically says, why work on it? It's not going to do any good. And so interpersonally, people perceive themselves to be in a very difficult situation, hence the term stagnation. So what we find is that typically in the stagnation stage, people know that something's wrong, but they either lack the motivation, the desire, or the knowledge for how to fix it. Now, a couple more things about the stagnation stage before we describe it in greater detail. First of all, the stagnation stage is not one that all couples go through on the way to termination. We've talked about the differentiation and the circumscribing stages, but the fact of the matter is many couples will skip this stagnation stage and go directly from the second stage of circumscribing to the fourth stage of termination. Most long-term romantic relationships will endure some short period of stagnation, but typically that period isn't very long. The really dysfunctional long-term relationships are the ones that tend to have a long stagnation period. And that's another thing to say about this stage. The stagnation phase can last for a long time. For example, marriages that stay together just for the kids are those marriages that often flounder in the stagnation stage. While the stagnation stage can last for a long time, one of the things that's very clear is that the detrimental effects of the stagnation phase are greater than those of any other stage. So for example, in the previous video, we talked about how difficult the circumscribing stage can be and the kind of detrimental effects that stage can have on romantic relationships. Well, the stagnation stage can have even more detrimental effects, as you'll see when we talk specifically about that stage. So the piece of advice that tends to be given is, if at all possible, avoid the stagnation stage. Another thing to be said is that when we talked about the circumscribing stage, we said that people typically make conscious choices to stay in that circumscribing stage. Unlike the differentiation stage, the circumscribing stage features conscious choice. However, here in the stagnation stage, we find that people end up being stuck in this stage, and they sort of choose to stay there, but there's a sense in which, because they lack the motivation to do anything, they're powerless to move themselves out of that stagnation stage. And that's why this stagnation stage is oftentimes so detrimental to relationships. So having said all of that, let's talk about what's going on communicatively in the stagnation stage. And first off, we have to recognize that most of what's going on here is intrapersonal. That is to say, it occurs inside people's heads. Because of the stagnation stage's difficulties, oftentimes people feel guilty. They know they should end the relationship, but they just don't see a path forward to doing that. They have a lot of apathy about the relationship and its problems. They have a pessimistic attitude, and so therefore they're not quite motivated to do what's necessary to make the relationship succeed. And so therefore, there's this really strong sense of guilt about what's happening. Communicatively, the conversations between the people involved in the romantic relationship are really shallow, and they seem as if they're rehearsed. They seem as if they're just very perfunctory. So if Romeo is now in the stagnation stage of his relationship with Juliet, the conversations the two of them have are really much more like roommates than lovers. They really have a superficial, repetitive tone to them. If they talk with any significance at all, it's very formal. If by formal we mean not very revelatory, not much self-disclosure going on, it's all very superficial. Hollow is the way one researcher describes the conversations that occur in this stagnation stage. Going through the motions is another phrase that a different researcher uses to describe the communication in the stagnation stage. As you might imagine, because people are in such a difficult situation, typically there's a withdrawal on the part of the people that are involved in the stagnation stage. So if Romeo has slipped into the stagnation stage, he may physically and emotionally and psychologically withdraw from Juliet. They may live in the same house, but they go out of their way not to interact with each other. And Romeo may not be there for Juliet in an emotional sense. Any kind of relational talk of any significance has all but dried up. And so Romeo really is just going through the motions at the dinner table as he talks with Juliet and as they move through the portions of their lives. So what might possibly drag people out of a stagnation phase? Well, researcher C.A. Isnard, I-S-N-A-R-D, offers what's called catastrophe theory. Isnard believes that people in the stagnation stage do lack the motivation to move themselves out of it. And so something catastrophic has to happen to move people out of the stagnation phase, to break this logjam and get people toward termination. Now, that catastrophe can be something like infidelity. That catastrophe can be some kind of an illness diagnosis on the part of the people in the relationship. In a marital context, it could be the death of a child. It could be some highly traumatic event. The point of the matter is, it takes something big to shake people out of the stagnation. And for Isnard, that catastrophe is sometimes the only thing that motivates people to do something different. Fortunately, there isn't much going on communicatively in the stagnation phase that's different than what happened in the differentiation and in the circumscribing stages. It's just that intrapersonally, people feel like they're in such a place that they can't move forward. If I had to rank the stages we've talked about thus far in terms of their detriment to the relationship, clearly the stagnation phase is first, followed closely by the circumscribing stage and then the differentiation stage. As I said earlier, many romantic couples will skip the stagnation stage and go directly to the fourth stage, which is what's called termination. Let's talk about termination. When Mark Knapp in his research labels the termination phase as he does, he's referring to something different than what you might think. For example, these previous three stages of circumscribing, differentiation, and stagnation all last for a period of time. They are something people move through and experience over some period of time. Termination, however, is an episode. It's a particular event. So if Romeo calls Juliet and says, "Juliet, we have to talk," and he sits her down and he says, "Juliet, I think we need to break up. Look, it's not you, it's me. I need to work on myself and be the best Romeo that I can, and you deserve better than someone who's flawed. So I'm going to break up with you. I'm going to go work on myself, and we'll see what happens in the future." That is termination. It's an event. It's an episode. It's not necessarily a stage in the sense that stagnation or circumscribing or differentiation are stages. A termination tends to be a one-event type of a thing. And so because of that, we have to look at this particular stage differently than we did the previous ones. One of the things the research finds in the termination stage is that we have certain specific expectations of what will happen in this termination stage. So more narrowly, in American culture, there are three things that we expect the termination to have. We expect it to be face-to-face, we expect to be offered a rationale or explanation, and third, we expect some kind of closure. So the idea of a face-to-face expectation simply says that if Romeo is going to break up with Juliet, he'd better do it face-to-face. He'd better not text her, he'd better not do it over Instagram, he'd better not send her an email. It needs to be face-to-face. Why? Well, one reason for that expectation is because of this idea that a face-to-face encounter communicates a message of greater respect than a text message might. Another reason for the face-to-face expectation is that if you sit down with someone in a face-to-face context, it's a richer communicative interaction. You're able to glean more from the nonverbal cues because you're literally in the presence of that person. There are not as many nonverbal cues in a text message or an email or even a Skype, a video call. And so therefore, this face-to-face expectation allows people to be present in the moment in a way that other avenues do not. Also, a face-to-face interaction, as opposed to a text exchange, for example, allows for a more immediate kind of a back-and-forth exchange, which therefore allows people to answer questions or follow up or just have a better interaction than they might through some kind of electronically mediated avenue. The second expectation is that there be some kind of a rationale. Juliet expects Romeo to give her a reason or multiple reasons why he's breaking up with her. And that's what Romeo did. When Romeo says, "It's not you, it's me," when he talks about his flaws, his need to work on himself, he's providing Juliet with an explanation. Why the explanation? Well, for several reasons. One, in American culture, we expect romantic relationships to work. The default setting seems to be that the relationship is going to be successful. It's going to be effective. But if for some reason that doesn't work, we see that as dysfunction. We see that as ineffective. In essence, the romantic relationship machine is broken. So there must be an explanation for why it's broken. So Juliet expects Romeo to offer her that explanation. Also, we in American culture expect romantic relationships to be learning experiences. We believe that each romantic relationship better equips us for the next romantic relationship. And so offering an explanation for why a romantic relationship did not work provides people with the knowledge they need to make it more likely the subsequent romantic relationship will be successful. And then third is this expectation of closure. Now, closure is a kind of psychological concept. It just means that there's something that symbolically puts an end to some other series of events. So in the case of Romeo and Juliet, closure can take many forms. Romeo might give back to Juliet all the stuff of hers that he had collected. Or it might be that Juliet gives back to Romeo the ring that he had given her. Or it might be that Romeo and Juliet have one last goodbye kiss and Romeo walks off into the sunset. Whatever it is, there's something within that relationship's relational culture that makes sense to create a kind of closure. So what Mark Knapp finds in his research is that in American culture, these three expectations powerfully influence what happens in that termination episode. Now, one of the things we can also say is that as Romeo stands in front of Juliet, he's offering this explanation of the romantic relationship's demise. That is what we might call a private account of the relationship. Private because it's between Romeo and Juliet. It's what Romeo tells Juliet. But there's also a public account of that relationship. So when Romeo goes back to his roommates and he explains to them that he has just broken up with Juliet, he's now giving them a public account. When Juliet talks to her family about why Romeo broke up with her and how that relationship came to end, Juliet is giving a public account. One of the things that Mark Knapp and other researchers have found is that these private and public accounts often differ wildly. In fact, the private account that Romeo gives Juliet is likely not to include the entire truth or even any of the truth to why Romeo is breaking up with Juliet. You see, one of the things we know is that when people go to terminate a romantic relationship, one of the interests they have is making themselves look good. They want to favorably manage the impression that people get of them. Now, there are many ways to do that. When Romeo says, "It's not you, it's me," he's actually making himself look good, looking as if he's a big enough man to recognize that, looking as if he's savvy enough to recognize the flaws in his personality. And so, although he's talking himself down, in an ironic way, he's actually making himself look good. And so because he wants to make himself look good, and also because he wants to have Juliet save some face, his private account to Juliet might not be the entire truth. It might also be that Romeo is interested in someone else. It might be that Romeo thinks that Juliet is too clingy or too needy. He doesn't say either of those things to Juliet because to do so would either cause her to lose face or cause him to lose face. And so the private account he gives Juliet might not be the entire truth. And that's what research finds. These private accounts typically do not include the entire truth. And actually, that's a functional positive kind of a thing. Because if people were brutally honest with why most romantic relationships are ending, probably wouldn't go over well. And so this protectiveness, this desire to help someone else save face and help you maintain face actually is beneficial, at least when it comes to the termination of romantic relationships. Now, if the private accounts don't include the entire truth about the death of a relationship, you can't expect the public accounts to do so either. And in fact, one reason the private and public accounts differ so much is because the public accounts are really intended to help people maintain the positive image they're trying to portray to other individuals. So when Romeo talks to his friends about why he broke up with Juliet, he might give them more of the truth and complain about her clinginess or her neediness. But the fact of the matter is he does that only to bolster his own image, to make himself look good. Likewise, in Juliet's case, she's doing much the same thing. She might be telling her family that Romeo, at the end of the day, really was a jerk, and you can't trust a Montague, and all that kind of thing. And so when she does that, not only is she making herself look good, she's also making Romeo look bad. And that's the thing. When we come to the public accounts, we're less desirous of the need to save the other person's face. And so that's why the public accounts sometimes will differ significantly from the private accounts. So at the end of the day, that research simply wants to remind us that we can't assume that the private account in the termination of a romantic relationship is entirely accurate, and nor should we be surprised if the public account and the private account are significantly different. Now, there's another aspect to this termination of a romantic relationship we need to talk about. It's what's called storytelling and relational endurance. So Romeo breaks up with Juliet, and let's say that Romeo's friends a couple of weeks later are just talking about women. So Romeo begins to tell a story about how he and Juliet, when they were together, they used to go to this particular park and feed the ducks. Now, Romeo's not with Juliet, but here he is telling stories to his buddies about his relationship with Juliet. Or, alternatively, Romeo begins dating someone else after he breaks up with Juliet. And so in his conversation with his new girlfriend, he's thinking back and tells his new girlfriend about how Juliet used to have this laugh like a pig and it was really annoying to him and how he's so glad his current girlfriend doesn't do that. See, even though Romeo is not with Juliet at this time, it's as if the relationship still endures. And it endures because of the stories he tells about that relationship. So one of the things we have to point out about the termination stage is that even though the breakup has occurred and the termination has ended the relationship, oftentimes relationships continue on in the stories we tell. That's important because we find that people often edit those stories. They revise the history. They change the recollections of the relationship to fit their needs at the current time. So when Romeo tells that story about Juliet's laugh and snorting like a pig, he does so, again, to make himself look good, and in this case, to make Juliet look bad. And so the relationship does endure in an odd kind of a way, but it tends to endure through revisionist history or through editing that tends to serve whatever purposes we have in that situation after the relationship is over. Robert Weiss is a researcher that's also studied the termination stage of romantic relationships, and his focus is on the common responses people have to the termination of a romantic relationship. One of the things that he finds is that people oftentimes have what's called a persistence of attraction and interaction. So what he means by this is that after Romeo and Juliet break up, there oftentimes is some continuance of interaction between the two of them. If Romeo and Juliet both happen to go to the same college, they're going to bump into each other. And how do they interact when they do so? If Juliet is still sort of stuck on Romeo, and so she kind of stalks him on social media or kind of lurks at the edges of his Instagram to see what he's up to, then the possibility exists that her attachment continues to persist. Or alternatively, if Juliet continues to solicit advice from Romeo, and Romeo willingly has conversations with her to provide that advice, because after all, he does want to be friends with Juliet, then there's a persistence of interaction. And so Weiss argues that certain kinds of persistences of interaction and certain kinds of persistences of attachment can actually make the end of a romantic relationship really, really muddy. That's why, for Weiss, the best thing people can do is create a clear sense of closure to the relationship. And so Romeo and Juliet have to draw boundaries that will govern their interactions in the future. Weiss also talks about what's called obsessive review. Obsessive review is this idea that oftentimes when people are broken up with against their desire, they over and over again in their mind go back to the relationship and ask, what did I do wrong? What could I have done differently? How could this have worked out in a better way? And it becomes obsessive in the sense that you dwell on it and ruminate it so that you end up keeping the relationship alive. So Weiss wants to talk about those two possible reactions and note that neither of them is necessarily healthy. What's far healthier is to not obsessively review about why the relationship didn't work. And it's far healthier to not maintain a sense of attachment in the sense where you're continuing to try and maintain that connection that has previously been broken by the termination. In fact, weighing in on this question of can people really be friends after they've broken up, here's what Weiss will tell you. If the breakup was messy, if the breakup was acrimonious, and if the relationship extended for a long period of time, then chances are better that people cannot remain friends, that people's interaction pattern cannot be what it was before. But if the opposite is true, if it was a relatively short relationship, if it was not a significant relationship, and if the breakup was more harmonious than acrimonious, then the chances are better that people can interact as friends afterwards and everything will turn out better. Now, in addition to what Mark Knapp talks about in his research regarding the end of romantic relationships, there's also the research of Steve Duck. Duck is at the University of Iowa, and he talks about two other ideas related to what's happening in the termination stage. The first of which is Duck's model of relational dissolution. Duck argues that to get to the termination stage, certain things have to be in place. And so what he finds in his research is that to the extent that certain factors are in place, couples are more or less likely to be taken to the termination stage. So for example, one of the things that Duck talks about in his research is what's called pre-existing doom. Duck believes that some relationships are just doomed to be unsuccessful from the start. This might be because they're simply mismatched, or it might be because the circumstances conspired against them. For Romeo and Juliet, because their two families have been at war with each other for so long, there was a sense in which they were doomed to begin with. Diane Femlee, F-E-M-L-E-E, also picks up this mantle and talks about what are called fatal attractions. Femlee believes that sometimes the very things that attract us to people will later repel us from those people, which then in turn contributes to this sense of pre-existing doom. So for example, if Romeo first met Juliet and found her to be fun, she was exciting, she was a free spirit, she was such her own person, that when he gets involved with her romantically over time, those same attributes begin to grate on him. And what he used to see as fun, he now sees as foolish. She thinks that she's immature. She thinks that her free spirit is uncontrollable. He thinks that she's really not quite the one for him because she just won't grow up. And so what once attracted him, the fun, now repels him because he sees it as foolish. That, for Femlee, is a fatal attraction. So there are certain kinds of fatal attractions that might contribute to the sense of pre-existing doom. A second kind of relationship that Duck believes gets people to the termination stage is what he calls mechanical failures. And that's simply where the communication is poor. The interactions are dysfunctional. People fought from the beginning. People were mismatched from the beginning, but the way they communicated contributed to those differences. So the problem isn't so much that they were doomed to begin with, it's just that they never ever developed the kind of interactions that were going to make the relationship last. They might have, for example, been in a situation where they weren't able to invest in the relationship, or one person invested and the other person didn't, or one person's expectations were high and the other person's were not. A third kind of relationship is what he refers to as a process loss. And the process loss is really related to circumstances. Process loss refers to the idea that Romeo and Juliet might have gotten together initially, but then they had to endure a long-distance relationship. And so as the process or the situation changed, so also did the outcome of their relationship. So what Romeo and Juliet find then is that the process of their relationship might have contributed to that demise. That's obviously very different than pre-existing doom or than the mechanical failure, because the mechanical failure is focused on the interactions of the two of them, whereas the process loss is more focused on the circumstances. And then finally, there's what Duck calls sudden death. Sudden death is when there's some event that happens that sabotages or causes the relationship to end. Romeo might cheat on Juliet. That's sudden death. It might be that Juliet has to change colleges because of the COVID-19 pandemic. She has to transfer closer to home. That's sudden death. There may be some piece of information that Juliet learns about Romeo, like he had been previously married and he never told her about that. And so the idea then is there's some revolutionary event that occurs that causes the relationship to end. And so for Steve Duck, those are the kinds of things that tend to get people to this termination stage. And then the other idea that Duck wants to talk about is what he calls a model of relational disengagement. This model of relational disengagement occurs in the termination stage. You see, for Duck, the termination stage is episodic, but that episode tends to have some things that precede it. So, for example, Steve Duck talks about what he calls a social process phase. And by this, he means that people often lay the groundwork for the termination before the termination occurs. So it might be, for example, that what's happening is that Romeo is telling his friends about how clingy and how needy Juliet is and how that's really grating on him. And by doing that, he's beginning to lay the groundwork for the exit, because after he terminates the relationship with Juliet, he can go back to his buddies and say, yep, see, I told you, she was clingy, she was needy. And so the groundwork had been laid previously. That's the social process phase. It's referring to people outside the relationship and how Romeo or Juliet or the people in the romantic relationship interact with those people and prepare them for the termination that will occur later on. Then, in this termination stage, Duck also believes there's what he calls a grave dressing phase. The grave dressing phase, in a sense, is coping with the end of the relationship in a socially acceptable manner. And so there's a sense in which, after she's been broken up with, Juliet is expected to be appropriately sad. Romeo is expected not to necessarily trash talk Juliet behind her back. Romeo is expected to play the role of someone who ought to be a little bit sad about the end of the romantic relationship. It's called grave dressing because it refers to this stage in the grief process that occurs when people die. It's this idea of creating a kind of closure. And on that part, one of the things that Duck talks about is the need for there to be this clear-cut closure. Now, we said earlier that Mark Knapp's research finds the expectation of closure. Here, we're talking more specifically about this idea that there's something symbolically to draw the relationship to a close. So, for example, Romeo and Juliet, in this grave dressing phase, cannot continue to interact in the same way after the breakup that they interacted before the breakup. So if they shared lunch together each day, they can't do that after they've broken up. If Romeo used to text Juliet multiple times each day, he can't do that after the breakup. Even if they want to remain friends, their pattern of interaction must be different. That, for Steve Duck, is an important part of the grave dressing phase. And then finally, there's what Duck refers to as the resurrection phase. The resurrection phase for him is constructing this new image of yourself after the breakup. The resurrection phase oftentimes is when people get into rebound relationships, or the resurrection phase is when people are able to get over the emotional upset that occurred with the end of a romantic relationship. And for many people, the resurrection phase occurs whenever their thoughts are not dominated by the people involved or by the events associated with that previous relationship. So Romeo might go through the resurrection phase after the termination when he begins to date the next person. Or Juliet begins to go through the resurrection phase after she's been broken up with, when she no longer ruminates or dwells on Romeo and what he's doing at various hours during the day. So this termination stage and the predecessor, the stagnation stage, form the last two stages in Mark Knapp's model of the dissolution of romantic relationships. It's not exactly a fun thing to talk about, but it is real life. And hopefully, having heard this research, you're able to connect it to your own experiences or to the experiences of people that you've seen. And now, because you know how the dissolution of romantic relationships works, perhaps in the future,